There is a quiet kind of sadness that never announces itself, a tenderness that hides beneath jokes about not caring or shrugging when someone asks about plans for the day you were born. For some people, birthdays feel less like celebrations and more like mirrors, reflecting everything they've avoided looking at all year. The passing time, the unspoken expectations, the strange pressure to feel happy on command. For them, a birthday is not a party, it is a spotlight they never asked for. It is attention they don't know how to hold. It is a reminder of emotions they weren't ready to meet. This is the psychology of people who quietly dread the day the world tells them they should feel special. A day that, for reasons they rarely share, feels heavier than it looks from the outside. There is a particular kind of discomfort that does not show up loudly. It moves quietly, almost politely, choosing not to disturb anyone. For people who dislike their own birthdays, this is where the story begins, not in dramatic pain, but in subtle, internal shifts they rarely name. A birthday approaches the way a spotlight drifts across a dark stage, slow, inevitable, and suddenly, without meaning to, they become the center of attention in a room they never asked to enter. For them, celebration feels complicated, not because they reject love, but because love, when directed fully at them, feels like too much weight in one place. Attention is a strange mirror. When everyone looks, they begin to see themselves through unfamiliar eyes. The flaws they thought they had hidden, the year they feel they didn't use well enough, the private disappointments that never left their chest. People around them assume it's simple. It's your day, you should feel happy. But inside, there is a quiet pressure to perform joy, to match the emotional expectations of those who care. And some people cannot force themselves into celebration without feeling like they are betraying something inside. For them, birthdays carry a delicate kind of exposure. It sits the one day the world insists they matter. And yet that insistence makes them retreat even more. They fear disappointing others by not celebrating properly. They fear being seen too closely. They fear the vulnerability that comes with being the focus of affection. Most of all, they fear what the day reflects back at them. Another year passed. Another chapter added to a story they're still trying to understand. So they shrink gently into the background. They downplay the day. They pretend it means nothing. Not because it truly means nothing, but because it means far more than they can safely hold. Here, in this quiet emotional beginning, the discomfort is not rejection. It is sensitivity. It is the heart's way of protecting itself from being looked at too closely, too suddenly, all at once. Discomfort rarely appears from nowhere. It grows out of stories the mind learned long before adulthood ever arrived. For many who dislike their birthday, the roots trace back to moments they barely remember, yet still carry quietly in the architecture of their emotional life. Sometimes it begins in childhood, in homes where birthdays were rushed, forgotten, or treated as ordinary days that didn't require gentleness. Not out of cruelty, but out of a kind of emotional poverty when no one knew how to make a child feel genuinely celebrated. In those early years, the mind learns an invisible rule. Don't sit, expect too much. Don't sit, ask for more. For others, the memories are different. The celebrations were there, but the emotional presence was missing. A distracted parent, a family argument, a gift that felt like an obligation rather than affection. Moments that taught the heart that attention can feel unpredictable, uncomfortable, or unsafe. There are also those whose birthdays were overshadowed by something painful. A loss, a conflict, a disappointment that happened on or around that day. And the nervous system, without intending to, began to associate the date with tension rather than warmth. Sometimes the root is even quieter. A child who grew up shy, sensitive, or deeply introspective may have found the sudden spotlight overwhelming. Having everyone look at them, sing for them, or expect a reaction felt like emotional overstimulation long before they had the words to describe it. With time, these early impressions hardened into patterns that whisper. Attention is pressure. Celebration is exposure. Affection is something earned, not received. By adulthood, the person may no longer remember where it started. They only feel the aftertaste, a subtle tightening when the calendar turns. A quick wish to skip the day, a familiar urge to blend into the background. The disconnect is rarely about the birthday itself. It's about the emotional history attached to it. A history that taught the heart to be careful on the very day others think it should be open. And so, what looks like indifference from the outside is often a quiet echo of something much older. A birthday may last only a day, but the psychological processes it stirs run far deeper than the candles, the messages, or the expected smile. For someone who dislikes their own birthday, the discomfort isn't random. It is shaped by patterns the mind has practiced for years, often without conscious awareness. At the core is self-concept, the quiet internal story a person holds about who they are. When that story feels uncertain, fragile, or unfinished, being celebrated can feel like wearing clothes that don't quite fit. Affection clashes with the way they see themselves, creating a subtle but powerful cognitive dissonance. Why are they celebrating me when I don't feel worthy of celebration? Birthdays also amplify social self-awareness. On ordinary days, people can hide behind routines, tasks, or roles. But on a birthday, the spotlight shifts inward. Suddenly the question becomes, who am I, really, outside of what I do for others? For those uncomfortable with being seen, this inner gaze feels like scrutiny. There is also the element of emotional overstimulation. Some personalities, especially introverted, sensitive, or internally driven ones, experience heightened emotional load when attention gathers around them. What feels warm to others can feel overwhelming to them, not because they reject care, but because too much care at once confuses their emotional rhythm. Underneath all of this lies the tension between the ideal self and the lived self. A birthday acts like a checkpoint. Another year passed. Another comparison between who they hoped to become and who they feel they are today. And if the gap feels large, even well-intentioned celebration can feel like friction against an unspoken internal reality. Finally, there is the psychology of receiving, a skill many people never learned. To receive attention, affection, or gifts requires openness, vulnerability, a willingness to let someone else sip's love land. For those who grew up self-reliant or emotionally unsheltered, receiving feels far more challenging than giving. What others see as a simple birthday is, for them, a convergence of identity, vulnerability, self-awareness, and emotional history, all illuminated at once. And the mind, protective as ever, responds by retreating. Inside those who dislike their own birthday, there lives a conflict that is both gentle and persistent. A tension between two truths that rarely coexist peacefully. The desire to be acknowledged and the discomfort of being seen. On one side, there is a quiet longing, a wish to feel valued, remembered, held in the minds of those who matter. Even those who avoid celebration still feel a faint warmth when someone says, I'm glad you exist." It touches a part of them they rarely feed, a part that craves tenderness. But on the other side lives a deeper instinct, the need to protect themselves from emotional exposure. Attention, even loving attention, can feel like standing under bright light with no place to hide. They worry about how they will appear, whether they will react correctly, whether their face will betray emotions they don't want to display. This creates a subtle but exhausting contradiction. They want connection, but they fear the cost of receiving it. For many, guilt becomes part of the mix. When friends or family try to celebrate them, they feel guilty for not enjoying it the right way. They worry they seem ungrateful. They worry others will misinterpret their quietness as rejection rather than self-protection. So they smile gently, soften their voice, and pretend to be okay. Not to deceive, but to keep the peace around them. There is also the inner pressure of expectation. A birthday carries an unspoken script. Be excited, be thankful, be joyful, be available. For someone who feels emotionally drained or introspective, that script feels impossible to perform without betraying their authenticity. And yet, choosing not to celebrate brings its own discomfort. The fear of disappointing others, the fear of seeming distant, the fear of being misunderstood. So they hover in the middle ground, wanting the warmth, shrinking from the spotlight, caught between gratitude and overwhelm. Their conflict is not about the people around them. It is about navigating an emotional terrain built from years of self-protection, a terrain where love is wanted, but closeness feels frightening. There comes a moment, often subtle, almost imperceptible, when something inside begins to shift. Not dramatically, not in the way movies portray transformation, but in a quieter, more intimate way, like a curtain being drawn back just enough to let a little more light in. For people who dislike their birthday, this realization often arrives unexpectedly. Maybe during a calm evening, maybe during a conversation, or perhaps during a simple pause between messages and missed calls. A moment when they finally recognize that their discomfort is not actually about the day itself. It is about what the day brings to the surface. They begin to see that their reaction is a story made of older layers, childhood patterns, internal comparisons, unresolved self-concept, and the weight of expectations they did not choose. For the first time, they notice how the date acts like a psychological magnifier. It doesn't create new emotions. It simply amplifies what has been quietly living in them all year. The self-doubt, the unspoken griefs, the unmet desires, the fear of being too visible or not enough. This realization can feel both relieving and unsettling. Relieving, because it puts words to what felt vague and confusing. Unsettling, because awareness makes it impossible to hide behind the old surface-level explanation of "I just don't like birthdays." They start noticing the pattern more clearly. How the urge to withdraw isn't rejection, it's protection. How the discomfort with receiving isn't rudeness, it's unfamiliarity. How the weight of attention isn't weakness, it's sensitivity in disguise. In this chapter of the emotional journey, nothing necessarily changes on the outside. They may still prefer a quiet day. They may still avoid grand celebrations. They may still feel overwhelmed by affection that arrives all at once. But internally, something softens. The birthday becomes less of an enemy and more of a mirror. Not a harsh one, but a reflective surface that helps them understand the tenderness of their own mind. A day that once felt heavy begins to reveal something else. That even discomfort has meaning, and that their reactions are not flaws. They are stories waiting to be understood. With awareness comes a quiet kind of integration, not the loud transformation people often imagine, but a slow, gentle rearranging of the inner world. For those who have spent years shrinking away from their own birthday, this stage feels like learning how to breathe in a slightly different rhythm. They begin to understand that comfort does not come from forcing themselves into celebration, nor from rejecting the day entirely, but from finding a middle space that feels emotionally truthful. This doesn't mean suddenly loving the spotlight. It doesn't mean enjoying surprise gatherings or wanting elaborate attention. It simply means they no longer turn against themselves for feeling the way they do. Self-compassion enters the room quietly, not as a lesson, not as an instruction, but as a soft acceptance. My discomfort has reasons. My reactions make sense. As they sit with this gentler perspective, the birthday begins to lose its heaviness. The date still arrives, the messages still come, the expectations still linger, but the emotional charge is different. They notice they can respond without guilt. They can choose calm without feeling flawed. They can accept affection in small doses without needing to perform joy or pretend excitement. Some begin to reshape the day entirely, not as an event to endure, but as a quiet ritual that matches who they are. A slower morning, a walk alone, a simple conversation with someone who understands, acts of acknowledgement that honor their sensitivity rather than challenge it. The integration is not about changing personality. It is about easing the tension between who they are and who they feel pressured to be on their birthday. Gradually, the internal conflict settles. The day becomes less of a test and more of a mirror reflecting growth, a recognition that they can hold their own emotions with gentleness. And though they may never crave celebration, they learn something deeper, that the meaning of a birthday is not in the noise, but in the understanding one carries within. The softening is quiet, but it is real. A shift that lets them exist more comfortably in their own presence. In the end, the story of someone who dislikes their birthday is not a story of rejection. It is a story of sensitivity, of a heart that feels life a little more deeply than others may realize. A heart that has learned to navigate attention, affection, and time with careful steps. As years pass, they begin to understand something quietly profound, that there is no right or wrong way to exist on the day they were born. There is no universal script for how joy should look, how gratitude should sound, or how celebration should unfold. Some people move gently through the world. They prefer soft moments over loud gatherings, authentic presence over forced excitement, calm truth over cheerful performance. And for them, a birthday becomes not a festival, but a pause, a subtle exhale in the middle of an ongoing life. They start recognizing that time is not an enemy. It is simply a companion that walks alongside them, sometimes quietly, sometimes insistently, but always with the intention of forward movement. The pressure to feel a certain way begins to fade. They no longer measure their worth by how many people call, or how excited they appear, or whether the day looks meaningful to others. Instead, they learn to measure it by something far more intimate, the gentle honesty with which they meet themselves. A birthday becomes a small doorway into reflection, a moment to acknowledge the layers they've lived through, the emotions they carried, the resilience woven into their quiet ways of being. And slowly, the day changes its shape, not into something loud or dramatic, but into something truer, a reminder that existence does not need applause to have meaning, that visibility is not the only form of being loved, that some souls are celebrated best in stillness. In this soft closing, the truth becomes clear. Those who hate their own birthday are not avoiding life. They are simply listening to it differently, in slower tones, in quieter chapters, in emotions that do not fit inside candles and wishes. And perhaps that too is a kind of celebration, one written not on a calendar, but gently within the self.